Hello there. I'm Park Howell, and welcome to the Business of Story. You've got an important story to tell your prospects, and it needs to be heard to convert them into lifelong customers. But you're not connecting as you could be because you're not using the one fundamental messaging framework that taps into your audience's primal brain, where all of their buying decisions are really being made. Therefore, I'm excited to announce my new short and sweet online course called The ABTs of Selling. In under 18 minutes, through 3 short instructional videos, you will craft, refine, and deliver an and, but, and therefore message in ABT that hacks through the noise and hooks the hearts of your prospects and customers. This course is only $35 and it will give you an unfair advantage in your sales and marketing. I promise, or I'll refund all of your money. So rid yourself of the old and tired way of selling and arm yourself with a better way. The ABT in this short course that will blow your mind and, more importantly, blow up your sales. You can access your course at businessofstory.thinkific.com or use the short link bit.ly/ABTs of selling. That's bit.ly/ABTS of selling. This messaging dynamo is absolutely second to none. So get after it right now and start putting the ABT to work for you. On today's show, I am absolutely honored to welcome back the one and only Tamsen Webster, who has helped leaders spin up their big ideas through her terrific red thread approach to storytelling, one that I even used when Tamsen coached me for my TEDx talk a few years ago. One of the biggest ideas I learned from Tamsen in trying to share my big ideas is this.
One of the most common things I see in people when they first come to me and they first talk to me about how they make the case for their ideas, it is the victim of circular logic, where if you strip away all the pretty copy and all of that, essentially their case is, this is the right answer because this is the answer that we think is right. And that just doesn't pass muster when you've got everybody's brains trying to rationalize why they shouldn't act. Like if they really stop and think about it and are like, well, I don't have anything other than them telling me this is the right answer, then it's just not going to work.
Tamsen Webster has spent the last 20 years helping experts drive action from their ideas. Part message strategist, part storyteller, part English to English translator, her work focuses on how to find and build the stories partners, investors, clients, and customers will tell themselves and others. Tamsen honed her expertise through work in and for major companies and organizations like Johnson & Johnson, Harvard Medical School, and Intel, as well as with startups that represent the next wave of innovation in life science, biotech, climate tech, fintech, and pharma. She's a professional advisor at the Martin Trust Center for MIT Entrepreneurship and a mentor for the Harvard Innovation Labs. She's also served for over 8 years as executive producer and idea strategist for one of the oldest locally organized TED Talk events in the world, TEDx Cambridge. She was a reluctant marathoner twice, is a champion ballroom dancer in her own mind, and learned everything she knows about messages, people, and change as a Weight Watchers leader. You'll hear more about that in just a minute. Oh, and by the way, Tamsen just came out with her brand new exceptional book called Find Your Red Thread, Make Your Big Ideas Irresistible. But what is the red thread structure to storytelling and sharing your big ideas? And how can you use its 5 components in your presentations? Well, please welcome to the Business of Story, Tamsen Webster, and she will show you how. Tamsen, I am delighted to have you back on the Business of Story.
Park, I am delighted to be back on the Business of Story. There's been a lot of business and a lot of story, so I'm sure we've got a lot to talk about.
Isn't that the truth? I mean, the last time you and I got to spend some good quality virtual time together pre-COVID was when you helped me with my TEDx talk using your red thread process. And I found
That's
it was
right.
absolutely marvelous. So the only thing I can say, it's about time you've come out with your book.
Yeah, it's someone asked me the other day, like, what's my child relationship with my book. And I'm like, well, my book is very overdue. So is it well past its due date? But it's coming out now. I'm so glad.
Doesn't it feel good to have it done and behind you, more or less?
Yes, yes. I think someone famously said, I don't remember which famous person said that it's like, I don't like writing, but I like having written. And that is very true for me. I actually quite dislike the process of writing. It's part of the reason why I came up with the whole red thread process in the first place. I can't stand a blank page. I don't like not knowing where to start. I don't like not having some kind of structure from which to invent and expand.
Mhm.
So really, this has just all been a way to solve my own neuroses.
Isn't that the truth? I mean, we're all fighting our own demons, and then we make businesses out of that quest, don't we?
Right. Yes. That's 100% true. I think that's a good place to start, though, if you're trying to build a business, like, because you probably are not the only one who has that problem. So
Yeah,
why not?
yeah. So, what is the problem you solve that you have dedicated your career to solving for people?
Well, I like to say I'm an English to English translator. So I solve the problem when words are the things that are standing in the way between the impact that someone's idea can have and the audience that needs to hear it.
All right, let's go a little bit deeper with that. So, I've got
Yeah.
a big idea and it's
Yep.
crystal clear in my mind, but I
Yes.
can't quite articulate it to get everybody else on board. Is that it?
Absolutely. I think we have all experienced that either by ourselves, for ourselves, or when other people have come to us and when someone says, well, what is your idea? And you think it's clear in your mind, and then the words start coming out of your mouth and they start looking confused, and you're like, I'm not getting it. And sometimes you eventually get enough spit out where someone's like, oh, I understand. But generally, the problem that I solve is taking that, which can be sometimes like a 20-minute explanation of an idea, and take it down to 20 seconds. But also to make sure that you've got the ability to expand that 20 seconds back up to, 20 minutes, 200 minutes, 200 pages of a book as well.
So, let's explore a little bit about your backstory. And how do
Yes.
you find yourself here? Because I know Red Thread has been a big part of who you are and what you're about for many, many years. But where, in looking back, were a moment, two or three, that you saw all this come together that informs who you are today?
Well, I think the first thread to lay in there, I'm gonna just beat this metaphor to death. But the first, I think, and I know, and I love this because I know you look for kind of these seminal story moments as well. And I'd say one of them really happened back when I was in high school, and I loved the arts. I also, however, loved being employed and employable. And I also recognized that I didn't have what I saw as the same level of passion for the arts that other folks around me did. So I knew I loved the arts, but I also knew I didn't have that kind of passion, dedication, and hustle to be an artist because, really, I just don't like to suffer, Park. And I was not willing to suffer for my art, at least not in that way.
What kind of
But
art
it
are you
really,
talking about? What kind of art were you
it
doing?
was theater, writing, creative writing, which of course is, amusing now because I still don't, I actually never liked it. I was, in high school, won an award, actually a couple awards for my creative writing, but I was like, take it or leave it. But I sang, I danced, I was musical theater, that kind of thing. But I knew that was not my future. But because I could see people, I had dear friends who that was their deep passion. And I was like, I just don't, whether or not my talent was the same, and I don't think necessarily that it was, I knew that my dedication wasn't the same. And really at that point, I was like, isn't it too bad that there are certain people who love certain things, and because it's not practical for them to do it, they don't do it. Like that passion, that dedication doesn't get out into the world. And, at the time, I was like, you know what? If I grew up and I had lots of money, I'd want to like run, and this is kind of funny, I want to run like artist salons. And the reason why it's kind of funny is because now, fast forward 30 years, 35 years, I do help run salons. I run TEDx Cambridge salons. But that's one of the pieces back then that really started it, was just this idea of like, how is it that we can make people who spend that much time, how could we make sure that pays off for them? And at the same time, when I started in college because I studied business in college and in grad school right after, because again, loves being employed. Suddenly I saw the other side of it. I saw these people who were entirely practical and they were lacking this kind of access to great ideas that would really change the face of what they're trying to do. And so I sat in between these two groups of people constantly, in undergrad and grad. Like I got 2 degrees at the same time, both times. And each time is like one was a practical degree and one was like a liberal arts degree. Because I was just equally interested in both.
What were those degrees?
So undergrad, I got Bachelor of Science in Business Administration. So that was a business degree with a
Uh-huh.
focus on marketing and market research. And then my BA is in American Studies with an art history minor.
See, and I think that's so smart. I think that because our middle child, our son Parker, went to film school, and I said, that's great, get your film degree, but also get at least a minor in business,
Something.
because
Yeah.
business drives everything. You've got the
Yes.
big ideas. You want to share the ideas with the world. You have to have that business acumen to be able to pull that off.
100%. And so I took that forward into grad school. So I have an MBA with a focus in organizational behavior and management communications. So I went kind of like from an outside external focus with marketing to an internal focus of management communications. And I got that at the same time as I got a master's in arts administration with a focus on crisis communications and art museums. So yeah, I kind of really sat in between. And in my work life after that, I kind of bopped back and forth from corporate to nonprofit to arts to corporate to but just back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And I was just really fascinated by this tension, the fact that both sides could benefit from each other, but they literally weren't speaking the same language. And it was the words that were the limit. People on the nonprofit side just couldn't quite always figure out how to convey the power of the nonprofit to potential donors. And then you've got people in business who have big ideas, but then they can't quite get them out there because business schools do tend to be so practical that they actually, they may teach you PowerPoint and they may teach you group projects, but they don't actually tell you how to articulate your ideas persuasively. And I just was continued to be really interested in that really started to take kind of shape on how that works when I'm in the midst of my marketing and brand strategy jobs. I started to moonlight as a Weight Watchers leader, which is a big part of my story. Because here I spent my days trying to figure out like what kind of messages would work at the market level. And evenings, weekends, mornings, I was discovering what actually worked at the individual level. And that taught me a really important lesson that what what doesn't work at the individual level will never work at the market level. And so if you really want to understand how to get a message to work broadly, then you have to understand how do you get it to work inside an individual person's mind. And so I had practice with that week to week, but I also started doing lots of research at that point, and that started to bubble into other things.
So that was the work you were doing in Weight Watchers and mentoring. Was that kind of a surprise aha moment from you? I mean, for you, you've got your MBA, you practiced in marketing and so forth. And so you're going in to help
Yeah.
these folks. And was it
Yes.
like a total aha?
Total aha, because it's like that so much of marketing communications, the way it's taught, and I would say the way it's practiced, is aspirational. That's the way that we think it should work if people just behave the way that we wanted them to, right? But it isn't the way that we work. So one of the things I often talk a lot about is that built into most marketing and sales messaging is this idea of like create a want in people or create new beliefs. Well, the reality is, and you know this from your research too, but I saw it just day in, day out at Weight Watchers. That's not how it works. I mean, it can work, but those are the two toughest levers to move in somebody's individual mind, what they want and what they believe. And yet we spend so much of our time as marketers, as storytellers, trying to do that. And what Weight Watchers really taught me, and one of the things that was a huge aha for me, was that the more that I could position a change in thinking or behavior within what they already wanted and what they already believe, the much more likely that they would be to take action, and really critical to what I was there to do, for them to take sustained action, for them to actually make a long-term change. So it really taught me that if you can change how people see, you will change what they do. And we spend so much of our time just trying to change what people do and not understanding why they're doing that in the first place.
So how did that then experience inform what you're doing with the red thread? And give us a little bit of backstory on how you arrived at the whole red thread concept to begin with.
Sure. Well, the red thread concept, there's lots of pieces to this story, but the red thread as a concept really started at the same time I started, or right around the same time I started as the executive producer of TEDx Cambridge, because here was a chance and an opportunity for me to help people with deep passions make their ideas like practical for everyday implementation. These were people who, had lost their native language of human speak, right, and spoke only in expertise. But I also had this additional thing where, like, unlike all my jobs in marketing, and even when I was in the Weight Watcher, room, I couldn't just say it this way, right? Like, that's not how it works. If you really want somebody to connect with what they're presenting and for the audience to connect with them, I mean, these had to be their words. They had to find the power in their ideas. So this is where I took a lot of the research that I'd done just to take my own and improve my own effectiveness in the Weight Watcher room, which then I kind of mapped out to my marketing jobs. And I said, okay, well, how can I reverse engineer what I do in a way that's repeatable for other people? And that's where, some of the research that I had done for both jobs at this point, both marketing strategy and for Weight Watchers came into play. And this is where, you are very familiar with all this, of course, was that understanding how people process information and make decisions. I was like, if I can figure that out, and if we can figure out a way to make information align with that, well, then I've got a way to be, to essentially create a Rosetta Stone between the passionate and the practical. And that, of course, that language that every human speaks is the language of story. And the language, not just of hearing stories and telling stories, but of processing information as a story in order to make it make sense. This, we assign motivations to people like, well, that person's altruistic, or that person's jealous, or roles to people. Well, I'm a victim, he's the hero, she's the hero, he's the victim, right? And we do that, and we tell ourselves a story. We create a story, often preconsciously, to make things make sense, to make it make sense to ourselves why this particular answer is the right one for this particular question, or why this particular solution is the right one for this particular problem. So what I decided to do was to say, okay, well, if that's how we process information, how can I simplify that so that even a non-story expert could figure out and find those elements to their idea? And let's break an idea into those component story parts. And if we could do that, well, then now they had a way to talk about their idea in a way that would just make immediate sense to people, because essentially what we'd be doing is uploading the story source code right into the audience's brain. And it turned out to work. Like, I mean, I kind of knew that it would based on how it was, but it turned out to work really, really well. The red thread name, though, came after, but that's how the process itself got started.
So is your process based on Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, or is it something completely different?
So it's not unrelated to Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. But what I observed, and this is one of the things that bothered me from a marketing standpoint, as much as the stuff that's based on hero's journey is useful and important, because, as Joseph Campbell pointed out, and as Nancy Duarte's work is so good at, it's such a prevalent story form that we recognize it intuitively, and it tends to be a fairly easy one for people to generate on their own. However, there were a couple challenges that I saw, particularly since I was oftentimes working with business people who just didn't have the time of day for anywhere for the between 7 and 12 steps of the hero's journey. You start to talk to them about rising action, falling action, and they're like, I don't,
Yeah.
no. Yeah. You start to lose them. The other thing is that it's not the only story format. And so that was the second point. So I was like, well, it's not the only format, right? Like, there's love stories, or as Nick Morgan will talk about it, he talks about love stories. Yes, quests like Hero's Journey, but there's also, he describes love stories and rags to riches stories, kind of along Kurt Vonnegut's story shape line. Nick also talks about stranger to strange land type stories. And I think the last one is revenge, if I didn't already mention that one. And so I was like, but that's also confusing to people. People don't necessarily want to sit down and go, all right, which kind of story is this? And that's why people hire Nick. So he can be like, here's how it would look in these different formats. So that's where I went back to neuroscience. And I came across some of the great work from Uri Hassan's lab out of Princeton. And one of the people in his lab, he's the one that did the TED Talk on mirror neurons and story, and how that, when someone hears a story, how it turns on those, the same kind of mirror neurons in someone's brain. But there was a follow-up study that they did that he was using the TV show Sherlock that was on BBC, but they wanted to see what people remembered of the story and whether or not there was consistencies in what people remembered. And there was, absolutely. So what was interesting is that people remembered different details, but the major plot points, everybody remembered. Everybody remembered, like, this person wanted this thing, and then this thing happened. And it was the major events that drove the story forward that everybody remembered. Everybody. So I was like, well, that's interesting. So that then sent me not to Joseph Campbell, but to screenwriting and novel writing books. Because part of that's because my sister is a screenwriter and a playwright. So I was just kind of curious because, at the time I was doing these, working with people on both keynote and TEDx like talks. So timing wise, they were the same length of content as would be in a half-hour scripted TV show or an hour-long TV show, right? Those are turned into about 20 minutes of content or dialogue and about 45 minutes of content or dialogue. So I was like, well, how do they do it? And then so I came into contact with great books like Cam Miller's The Hero Succeeds and Blake Snyder's Save the Cat. Looked at it on novel length with Sean Coyne's Story Grid, and started to say, okay, well, in these areas, folks have kind of simplified some of these core elements down to these things. And if people remember these same things, according to like the Princeton studies, I was like, what would happen if we just mapped them over to each other? So what I did was I looked across all the kinds of stories, once upon a time stories and brain stories. And I said, okay, which elements do all of them have? And how can I get that to the minimum number of points possible? Because I wanted to get to a point where business people, academics, experts of any kind, where I could basically say, just answer this question. You don't have to worry about who the protagonist is. You don't have to worry about rising action, falling action, call to the quest, refusal to the quest. You don't have to worry about any of that. Just answer this question. What question are the people you're talking to trying to solve and haven't found an answer for yet? Well, most business people can answer that question. And I could say, okay, and that would establish the beginning of the mental story, right? Because the story really starts the minute that we know what somebody wants. There's context and whatever, but the minute something happens, usually the inciting incident, that allows us to go, oh, Harry Potter wants a family and it is not this one, right? That's when you start to care, and that's when you start to go, okay. So I was like, okay, then what's the next big thing? Okay, the next big thing is the introduction to a problem people don't know they have, right? It's what starts the second act. It's what starts the conflict, where a new problem, a big problem, a world-changing problem gets presented to them. And so collecting from all the stuff I'd done in the past, I looked at it and said, all right, well, how does that work in business messaging? What is that problem? And what question could I have people answer that would help them find it? And it really could boil down to where are people focused on right now? And where do they need to be focused on? Because back to what I said earlier, in order to change what people do, you have to change how they see. So how are they seeing the situation right now? How do you see the situation, right? Either individually or as a company. All right, what's the next big thing that was in all stories? Well, all stories have a moment of truth, right? My favorite word for this, I'm sure you know it, Park, but I love it. The anagnorisis. Oh, such a good word. It's a Greek word, and it is a very specific meaning. It's the moment that the hero recognizes the true nature of their circumstances. And in that moment, right, is the climax, the midpoint, the point of no return, whatever you want to call it, right, where all of a sudden, like, you cannot go back. It forces a choice. They have to do something different. And this was an exciting discovery to me because I was like, this is what almost all business stories lack. They've got a setup, they introduce a conflict, and then they skip straight to the resolution. And I'm like, but the resolution doesn't become inevitable. It doesn't become irresistible until that moment of truth happens. So I was like, okay, what creates that moment of truth? So that's became that third question. I was like, okay, well, what is a belief that your audience shares with you, which would make that problem that you've presented to them impossible to ignore? What is something that you can either inform them of or remind them of that makes them go, oh crap, like some part of their brain go, if I still want what I want and I believe this truth that I have, then I have to shift how I'm looking at this, right? Like that's how it works. And so then the other kind of points became fairly clear. Okay, if that truth forces a choice, what is that? What is the big change? Like that's what starts you into the resolution, right? That's that fourth element. And then what do folks do? What are the specific actions that they take or need to take in order to make that realistic? And again, those were easy questions for most people to answer. I should say simple questions. They're not always easy.
Right.
And then I realized those were the major points because when does a story end? The story ends when you know whether or not the main character got what they wanted in the first place. And so if we tie it back to the goal, there it is. So that's where it is. That's what it is. That's how I did it.
Yeah. And so you've taken story and you've chunked it down into actionable, pragmatic question and answers for your audience, for your client, for our listener to do. And in the answering of those questions, they are creating a story, but they're not relegated to some sort of academic story structure in this
Correct.
case.
And they're not, and
Yeah.
they're creating information that can be a story. But the most important part was that their brain would recognize it as a story. It would feel like a story. It would have the power of a story. It would have the clarity of a story. Even for people like many of my original TEDx Cambridge folks were, and certainly my clients are now, who do not consider themselves natural storytellers. So it gave them
Yeah.
a way to gain the power of story without feeling like they had to gain this ability that seemed beyond their reach.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's really empowering to people see that because I can once they start to get when they're like, oh, that's it, like that's all I have to find, and I can still harness that. Absolutely. And can you flip it to start telling once upon a time stories? Absolutely. And yeah, it's a lot of the work I do too. But when it comes to an idea, when it comes to your value proposition or your elevator pitch or whatever, the best ones follow the structure of a story, whether or not you tell them as a story, and
Yeah.
that's the
Absolutely.
cool thing. Yeah.
Now you've taken us through the mechanics of it. Can you give us an example of it in action? Maybe someone you've recently worked with, or even how you've used it for yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a bunch of examples in the book, so I'll use one of those. So probably one of my favorites is a startup client here in the Boston area called Your and they came to me because they needed help improving their investor pitch. They needed help trying to figure out how to make it clearer what they did. And so when I first asked them, okay, that's great, but what do you do? They said, well, we make patient-friendly diagnostics that improve adherence to medications. Okay,
Okay.
you
Hmm.
answered my question. Thanks. Um, but this is a great example of like the kind of people that I love to work with because their product actually does something really important. It helps people stay on critical medications longer. See, and this is context that we found out. I was like, all right, tell me more about that. And they said, well, there's a lot of people all over the world that suffer from diseases like high cholesterol and HIV, where they can't feel the effects of the disease, right? They have it, but you don't feel it. Like if you have high blood pressure, high cholesterol, HIV, you don't feel it in your system. And yet taking medications for those drugs is really important in order to keep those conditions under control. But there's a problem. Again, this is all known problems, so we're not even really in the story of the idea yet. But the problem is that the because you don't feel the disease, you don't feel the effects of the medication for it either. So it's not like, if I have a headache and I take Tylenol and the Tylenol goes away, I can go, yeah, I know, like I've taken my medication. What happens is people tend to forget that they take it because they don't actually ever feel bad.
It's a
All right,
total
so that's
cause and effect thing.
total cause and effect thing, right? But
Yeah,
that doesn't really exist in these. So
exactly.
so that first question, what question are people asking that doesn't have a great answer yet, right? Or have they not been able to answer it for themselves really yet? Was how do we keep people on critical medications longer? Right? That's the question that they realize that their audiences, partners, and providers wanted to answer, because all sorts of reasons why it makes sense to keep these people on their medications, like rather than have them go off. Okay, next question. Where is this problem of perspective? What's actually getting in the way? Where are people focusing? What lens are they using right now that's actually keeping them from seeing another opportunity? Or in the case of a pitch like this, where do most people look? Where did you decide to look because it looked like an opportunity? And for this, it turns out how, the way that most people, doctors approach this problem right now is they basically just ask their patients when they're in the office, have you been taking your medication? And most patients, again, believe that they are taking them, and the doctors believe them too. And so the doctors in the office will take a blood test to back it up, but the blood test takes a couple weeks to come back. So they have to rely on what patients recall more than anything else. They can't really rely on those tests. And it's that tension between what patients recall and what tests reveal that actually creates the real problem that You're Sure needs to solve for people, because they believe their clients, but the tests say otherwise, but the tests don't come back really quick. So now we need to create that anagnosis, right? That shared truth that makes the problem impossible to ignore, and particularly in the case of investors for Your Sure's approach make perfect, logical, and emotional sense. And so we actually went with a classic proverb, which is a great place to find truth statements, by the way. We went with seeing is believing. Seeing is believing. So we all want to know, how can you keep people on critical medications longer? The problem is we have to focus more on what patients recall than on what tests reveal. And yet we can all agree it's true that seeing is believing. So now we go to the change. What's the change that You're Sure decided to put in place? Well, they decided they needed to turn the effects that people can't feel into results that people can see. In other words, they wanted to find a way to make the invisible visible instantly. That's the change. How did they do that? So they decided to create these urine tests that providers could administer to their patients right in the office, so that in addition to the conversation about it, they could see how much of the medication was in someone's system, so they could take immediate measures to either correct a situation or to kind of put their focus elsewhere because it wasn't necessary. So by the end of this, now that we had found all those ingredients, right, they can do a quick elevator pitch from all of that, but we were able to switch them from saying we make patient-friendly diagnostics that improve adherence to medications to we help people stay on critical medications longer through simple tests that turn the effects people can't feel into results they can see.
Yeah.
And that's
why that's so powerful right there is you were able to move them from promoting and talking about what they make into what do they actually make happen in people's lives. And that is one of the biggest mistakes I see over and over and over again in the sales game, in the branding game, in the business game. Let me tell you and show you and pound my chest about this wonderful product or service that I make. Versus here's what it actually makes happen, the impact in the world.
Yeah. And
That's beautiful.
This format too, what it does is it's a thing I say to my, particularly to my business clients the most. I was like, people have to agree with the principles before they'll agree with the product. And we flip that all the time. We start with a product and then we're like, and then here's why. And, Daniel Kahneman's work, points out that, the way our brains work, that we will always understand something more clearly if you tell us what it does before you tell us what it is. And it's exactly what you just said, Park. And so it's a flip, and it's so fun. I've probably ruined the lives of my children, but I've taught this way to my children. And so my poor older son was doing this essay for English class, and he put it in this format, and then they were like, this is not the format that we recommended. And he's like, but the other format doesn't make sense to me, Mom. And I'm like, honey, doesn't make sense to me either. But sometimes you just got to follow the rules. But the way you did it first was better. So, because it was the classic academic format of here's my conclusion, let me defend it, rather than here's the, principle 1, do you agree? Let me prove that principle. Principle 2, do you agree? Let me prove principle 3. Okay. And all of those taken together mean this is the conclusion, rather than here's the conclusion, here's why it's right? It's, if these things are true, then this conclusion must be true. And that's a huge flip, particularly in business messaging, because as you say, most of the time we just here's what it is. This is awesome. And even when we talk about what it does, we talk in the terms of the effects that it causes, but not why it causes those effects. And we just skip right over. Like I said, we skip from here's your problem, here's our solution. And most messages, most stories by business folks, not storytellers, but this was the big thing I saw missing between the instruction on storytelling that was given to business people, or presentations or persuasive communications given to business people versus what storytellers, screenwriters, novel writers, TV writers are taught. The business case was missing that moment of truth, and they weren't there. Even some of the great adaptations of the hero's journey that are out there also miss that moment of truth. It's like someone will come in and here's this plan, and then poof, we adopted the plan and it happened. But something had to happen in someone's mind to go, I have to accept this plan. And this is one of those things where it is a subtle point, but it makes such a difference to someone's case. Just by saying seeing is believing, you're like, well, of course, then your test would make sense. Of course, if we can see it, that's going to be a great solution than something that we can't see until 3 weeks later.
Yeah. And going back to this idea, the experience you had with your eldest son, is that starting with that conclusion, and so in academia, they teach you to do that. Maybe as you go up through your MBA route, it's the same thing. But you know what that does? I'm starting with my conclusion, and I'm telling you, Tamsen, this is what I've learned, and this is the way it is.
Yeah.
Let me show you how.
Yes.
So what I've just done is metaphorically got you to cross your arms and go, oh yeah, smart guy?
That's right.
Prove it to me.
Yes.
Now I've got to win you over for the rest of the story, for the rest of the presentation. And chances are I ain't going to do that. But if you start with these beliefs and get them nodding, unfold their arms and start nodding with you, say, Tamsen, that's right. Oh, you're right. That is a good point. And then when you bring them all together, can we agree that this is a truth? Yes. Okay, now you have made your story their story.
Correct.
And you have invited them in. And that's the beautiful thing about the red thread and what you do. Why in academia, and I know you hang around Harvard and some of those high thinking places.
Yeah.
Why are we so stuck in academia by teaching students how not to communicate well? Why is that?
If I had the answer to that question, Park, I'd have $1 million. I don't know. So I'm doing my part kind of client by client, academic client by academic client, little piece at a time. What was interesting is that one of my TEDx Cambridge recently is originally from Germany. And, she had this realization partway through when we were talking. She's like, this is the way I was taught in Europe, the red thread. She was like, I was taught this way. She's like, it's only in America that we have this weird start with a conclusion and defend it. I don't know if that's
You know why that is? You know why that is? I believe it's that American pioneering spirit. I'm going to show you the way it is, whether I'm right or wrong. It's the way we're headed. And by golly, that's what it's going to be.
Yeah.
And I think that's literally what it comes down to.
I think it probably is true, but like, as you said, what happens when you start that and you put, when you start with your conclusion and have to defend it, even the language is there. You, the speaker, the author, the writer, you are on the defensive, and so are they from the get-go. That is not a position of strength. It is not a position of partnership. And so many, particularly the B2B companies that I work with, like that, they want to be seen as a strategic partner. Well, a strategic partner doesn't come in and say, everything you're doing is wrong. Let me show you the right way.
Yeah.
A strategic partner goes, so most of the people we talk to, like, you have this question. Is that your question too? Or what's the version of it? Oh, okay. And most of the time when we see people approach it, they're kind of focused over here. Would you agree? Yeah. And then you validate that. I think that's so hard, particularly what I see in sales teams that I work with, for them to do. It's really hard for them to go, but what they're doing is wrong. How can I validate it? I'm like, you have to remember that one of the huge drivers of human beings, every single one of us, is that we want to be seen as smart, capable, and good. And so the moment you tell someone they're doing something wrong, I mean, this, it's that crossed arms, like you are engaging a nearly insurmountable cognitive bias against you. You're engaging, what is known as psychological reactance, because it feels like you've just taken their agency, their ability to control their own life, desires, choices away. And their 100% human reaction, both rational and not, is going to be to reject anything that you say. Because one of the most powerful forces in the universe, both physically and mentally, is homeostasis, to keep things exactly where they are in balance, which means anytime that you are trying to persuade someone, you have to understand, like, that you're going to be more successful if you understand that what you are fighting always is the status quo. But there's a reason why they are enjoying the status quo. And if you don't validate that and find an even more powerful reason to change the status quo, you never will. Because everything in the human wiring will be to tell a story to themselves that will justify not changing. So you have to make the story of change way more irresistible than the story of staying the same. And the only way you can do that is with something that feels fully familiar to your audience, which is not new information. I mean, there can be new arrangements of information, but again, it's not about saying, you want this, you should want this instead. And it's not saying, I know you believe this, but you need to believe this instead. The way that you can make that happen goes, because I know you want this, because I know you believe this, doesn't this help you actually achieve both things even better? Like, that's where you want to get to.
Well, your book is coming out. Where can people find it? And now they don't have it in their hot little hands right now. Tell us 2 or 3 things that we can all do to start thinking in the red thread mentality.
Okay. So they can find it and all links to various places where they can buy it at redthreadbook.com. Just made it super simple. They don't have to remember my name or anything, just redthreadbook.com. And that will take them to basically all the online places in the world that you can order the book. Certain things, what can you do to start right now applying the red thread? I would say the very most important thing to do is a thing I've mentioned a couple times now. Identify a question that your audience is asking out loud to other friends, to their colleagues, whatever, for which they don't yet have an answer, but you do. And articulate that question in your audience's language. Now, it's probably going to feel like the wrong question to you. It's probably going to feel like a really unsexy, undifferentiating question for you. But if you have an answer and one that makes intuitive and intellectual sense to them, it becomes incredibly differentiating. And oh, by the way, they're going to pay attention to it because remember, they don't have an answer to it yet. So you don't have to be excited about their question, but they must be excited about your answer. So I really say that's one of the best places to start, is to identify that question, because that's where their story is going to start in their brain.
And you identify that question by simply asking it, I guess, or how do you uncover that in enough people that you know that is like a core truth that you have found and you are going to help with?
Well, it's all sorts of different ways. Counterintuitively, I'm going to say the one way not to do it is to ask your current clients what they were looking for when they hired you, because most of them actually won't remember accurately. They'll remember the thing that they got at the end. So they'll remember that, oh, I got this other thing. Like, yes, you gave me the thing I was looking for, but I got all this too, which is awesome. But you can't start there because that's not where people are now. So what's more effective is to look for instance, like what search strings land people on your website. Or you can ask, friends, colleagues, or you could say, what questions does someone ask where you're like, you need to talk to X or take a look at? Very easy, kind of super simple ways to do this. You can use search engines to your advantage. Start typing in questions that are related to your idea and the topic or your product or service, and see how the predictive text fills in. I also love services like answerthepublic.com, where you put in a keyword and it'll show you across multiple search engines, like what are the most common questions that people ask about that thing. So I think a lot of times people stress about this. The most important thing really is just that it isn't the question you wish they were asking, and it needs to be a question that they're actually asking, for which your idea, product, or service does in fact offer an answer. Now, a quick caveat on that, because someone goes to my site and they see that my site leads off with like, want to make your ideas irresistible. They're like, well, are people walking around saying that? And I'm like, no, but that's ad copy. But if I'm like writing keynote descriptions or things like that, I can say, well, we all want to drive action from our ideas. Or when you're in a sales conversation, you want to raise the probability of success, right? So those are questions that I know people are asking. How can I increase conversions from my content marketing? How can I raise the probability of success in a donor or a sales conversation? How can I drive actions from my ideas? How can I get a yes, right, when I have previously gotten no's? Those are questions that people are asking. And in the case where I put it together, it's like when it comes to marketing copy, that's a place where you can take what they're asking right now and turn it up one notch. Because if somebody already has that question and I can just say, hey, do you want to make your ideas irresistible? They're like, yes, that, because I was just trying to get my probability of success up. But there's this intuitive connection with, if I can get my idea to be irresistible, I'm going to get both. So, but let me be clear, when I'm writing content, writing my newsletter, like writing keynote descriptions, when I give keynotes and workshops, I'm not like, that's not my opening statement, is not about making ideas irresistible. It's about answering a question that they have right now and then moving them to saying, okay, well, if you want to do that, the best way to make your ideas irresistible, just, and here's the main point of the book, is to build the stories that people will tell themselves about it. And that's I think the other big thing, that it's a big point about how people get started with it, but it's the big mental shift that starting to find their question really gets you on the path towards, which is that, so often when we're trying to, talk about our ideas and make the case for them, we build the case that we make and would make as the expert who already assumes that it's the right answer. And that's really, I think, the real big idea and the real thing that people really can start thinking about if they want to start applying this red thread approach is to really flip the lens around, right? And make sure that you're building the skeptic's case for your idea, the case that somebody who isn't already convinced of your idea, what they would say. Because I see, one of the most common things I see in people when they first come to me and they first talk to me about how they make the case for their ideas, it is the victim of circular logic, where if you strip away all the pretty copy and all of that, essentially their case is, this is the right answer because this is the answer that we think is right. And that just doesn't pass muster when you've got everybody's brains trying to rationalize why they shouldn't act. Like, if they really stop and think about it and are like, well, I don't have anything other than them telling me that this is the right answer, then it's just not going to work. So the book is really designed to walk you through the step-by-step process to build the skill, absolutely, of saying, what does my idea look like from the outside? And how can I build a better path using the structure and the language of story from where somebody is now through all the turns of the maze to this idea that you believe is going to really change their world in some way, big or small.
Well, I can't wait to read it. I don't have my copy quite yet, but I have been through it with you, and I know how powerful it is. One little side anecdote on that, and I don't know if you recall this or not, Tamsen, because you work with so many people. When I was doing my very first, my one and only TEDx, I was thinking, okay, I've got to get prepared for an 18-minute presentation. And you said, oh, no, Park, do the short one. Do the 9-minute one. That's the best one because you get everything, you get really super. So that's what I did. And then I showed up, but they said, Park, there's 5 of you presenting and you are the only one with public speaking experience. Therefore, you are the anchor and we need an 18-minute presentation out of you.
Of course.
I thought, back to the drawing board. But the red thread helped me through all of that. So I was able to build off of that first 9-minute one and double it in length. And I kind of wished I could have kept it at the 9-minute.
Well, that's one of the things that I do talk about in the book where, the core, drawing from that inspiration that I got from particularly screenwriters, was that understanding both the through line, or log line of what that content is. So being able to summarize the idea in a sentence and being able to summarize kind of in a really captivating way what the plot of the story is, of the idea is really critical. And those same elements are present, whether it's a 10-minute talk, a 20-minute sitcom, a 40-minute talk, an hour-long series. Like, those elements are still there. The only thing that is different is how much time you spend setting them up, going into detail, providing additional illustration, other persuasive information, expanding, bringing outside and telling stories. And that's what I say over and over to my clients is that if it is strong at the smallest scale, it will be strong enough to build anything else on. The thing is, a lot of times we get fooled when we can sit and expand on something and expound on it for an hour or more. They're like, this must be great and it must be, strong enough to build on. But when you take it down to its component parts, like I said, a lot of times you realize that it's missing some pretty important major pieces. And so many times when someone's message isn't working the way they want it to, it's because one of those core 5 elements is either in the wrong place or it's missing entirely. And so that's one of the things to kind of look at too when you're looking at your own work, is to say, okay, well, do I have all these elements? Like, not only is it from this audience's perspective, but am I leaving something out? Am I leaving something out that is really critical for their full understanding and acceptance of this idea?
Would you outline those 5 critical elements one last time as we close the show?
Absolutely. So it's a goal, which is a question that your audience wants and needs an answer to, but doesn't have yet. A 2-part problem, where your audience is currently focused and where you need them to focus in order to see your idea clearly. Third, a truth that is shared that makes the problem impossible to ignore, right? The change that truth forces the choice about. So a high level shift in thinking or behavior that the truth that results from that moment of truth, the actions that make that change concrete. And then you kind of, even though it's linear, you kind of make it circular, and then you go back and revisit the goal, show people how they got what they're looking for, and ideally how they got so much more as well.
That is awesome. And thank you so much for being here with us today on The Business of Story. This has been kind of a funky production because I actually had to go on the road today. So you are coming to me through my laptop, and that's why we've had some fun with our technology here. So thank you for hanging in there with me.
You're welcome. It's always a pleasure, Park. Thank you so much for having me back.
Oh, you're welcome. And thank you all for listening to this edition of The Business of Story. If you like what you heard, absolutely share it out with your friends, families, colleagues, anyone that you know that could do a better job of sharing their ideas, or maybe more importantly, want to make their ideas irresistible. I am a testament to the red thread. It works beautifully. Get the book, Get it in your hands. You are going to love it. And if I can be of service to you, come on over to thebusinessofstory.com, where I've got lots of tools, tips, techniques, and wonderful talent like Tamsen there, ready to help you craft and tell compelling stories that sell by just activating the insights that they share with you here. And until next week, remember that the most potent story you'll ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make it a great one. Thanks for listening.